Welcome to the Thoughtful Leader podcast. My name is Ben Brearley. I'm a leadership coach and the founder of Thoughtful Leader. The Thoughtful Leader podcast is all about short, sharp leadership advice because thoughtful leadership is good leadership. Welcome to episode 316 of the Thoughtful Leader podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about 4 ways to convince yourself to do difficult things when you know you really want to do them. So let's get into this topic right now. Now, this may not be a popular opinion, but I think leadership is often filled with situations where you have to do things that maybe aren't comfortable for you, but you need to do them anyway. So for example, you might need to have a difficult conversation with an employee or a colleague or your boss. You might have to give a speech at work, which is going to be stressful. You might have to hit a hard deadline, which will require you to work late. All these things, all the possibilities are endless in terms of the hard things you might have to do. Obviously, leadership is also rewarding. There's lots of benefits you get from leadership, such as creating a bigger impact, helping people around you improve, helping your team enjoy their work and be the best version of themselves. It's also very rewarding as well. However, it'd be remiss of me not to consider, it's hard to do some things in leadership. So how do you convince yourself to do them? Because often what I found was there's things that nag at me. Like I think I probably should have a conversation with that person, like my boss, and negotiate my workload, but it's a difficult conversation and I'd rather not. So I'm going to avoid that conversation and do something else instead. So when I notice those things happening, there's a couple of things I do when I want to try to help myself feel the motivation to do things that are difficult. The first thing I do that works really well for me is to consider the consequences of not doing the thing. So if I don't do something, what are the possible outcomes that could happen that would be bad? So for example, I remember years ago in leadership roles, having to have a difficult conversation with a team member and, about performance or behavior. Obviously, that's an uncomfortable conversation and I don't want to do that. But then I consider the impact of not doing that and I think, what are some of the consequences? It could be that the other team members get annoyed or angry or upset because I'm not addressing the problem. So there might be team morale issues and that will be worse than having the difficult conversation in the first place. So that helps me feel motivated to go and do the thing, even if maybe I don't actually feel like doing it at that time. I also like to think about the feeling of regret I might have, right? And I'm not a big fan of regretting things. Like, I don't like the idea that I would look back and go, I'm disappointed in myself. I don't like that. And so that helps me also act as a consequence for helping me go and do the thing. And this actually corresponds with a topic in motivation theory, and it's known as towards and away from motivation. So the concept of away from motivation is such that away from motivation is where you're motivated to get away from a negative thing. So for example, if you're in a burning building, you are motivated to run away from the fire. It's not a positive motivation in that you're going somewhere else that's positive. You're trying to avoid a negative. Whereas the opposite would be toward motivation, which is I'm going towards some benefit. So what I'm doing here in these technique is harnessing the power of the away from motivator, which is really, I want to avoid a negative consequence. And my mind works well like that. And so it helps me to feel like motivated to do something difficult. The second thing I would advise you is to ask yourself the question, do you want to be seen as the sort of person who doesn't do these things? Or do I want to be a person who doesn't have a difficult conversation? Do I want to be the sort of leader who doesn't negotiate my workload with the boss? And these sort of statements and questions I think are really important. And the reason is because they talk to your identity as a leader or as a person. So when I'm at the park and there's some rubbish there, honestly, sometimes I can't be bothered picking it up because I think, someone else should pick it up because they threw it there, right? And then I think, do I want to be seen as the sort of person, or do I want to be the sort of person who doesn't pick up rubbish at the park? And I go, no, I don't. I want to be the sort of person who picks up rubbish at the park and makes it cleaner. Now, this might sound like a silly example, but it talks to your identity as a person and as a leader. And sometimes I think, for me at least, it can be motivational to consider, is this the type of person or the type of leader I want to be? And when the answer is, well, no, then it helps you create a positive view. And you can say, I do want to be the type of leader who has a difficult conversation about behavior in my team because I know it'll make the team stronger as a result. And then you turn that into a positive. So I think that's a really important and powerful question, is to, what sort of identity do you want to have as a leader? Do you want to be the type of leader who avoids things, or do you want to be the type of leader who steps into those things and engages with them even when it's difficult? So that's another technique I like to use, which I find quite helpful. Now, another tip that I like is to consider the difficult thing as a learning experience and to go into the situation in order to learn how to do it better. So in my work now, sometimes I run workshops and training sessions for people, and it's a new audience and I don't know what it's like. And have I done this topic before? No. And so sometimes it's very stressful because I'm thinking, well, am I going to be good at this? Is it going to be a disaster? Now, I've found it very useful to start thinking of it as a learning experience. So when I'm going to have this difficult conversation with this person, I can reflect on what went well, what didn't go well, what did I learn from that? What did I learn by doing the hard thing? And if you can treat it as a learning experience and a way to practice the skill of difficult conversations, for example, then it becomes an opportunity for you to get better and not a time when you have to deliver a 10 out of 10 performance in this conversation, because that added pressure is stressful. So it's not that you don't put effort in and you just think, well, I'll just see what happens. You can still prepare and plan and be good in your preparation. But it does mean that you're going to take the outcomes from it as a learning experience, and it's as a learning experience as a leader, and how do you improve out of it? And that's the real benefit. And it helps you go in there with a bit of a softer mindset, I think, because you're going to learn. You're not there to get it perfect. You're there to see what happens, do your best job, and learn what could have done better, and learn what worked really well. So considering it a learning experience is a really useful way to think about it as well. So the last tip I have for you today is another reflective question, and this is, remember, trying to motivate yourself to do difficult things, is to ask yourself, what would a really good leader do in this situation? And what I find when I ask this question to myself, it's often the answer is usually, well, they'd go and do this thing. They'd go and knock on the door and they would have a difficult conversation with their boss because they'd know that it's going to result in a better outcome. So that is a really powerful question as well. And what it does is it takes the focus from you and puts it somewhere else. So rather than think about, should I do this or should I not do that? You're thinking about, what would a really good leader do in this situation? And often the answer is they would do something that's difficult because they know in the long run it would result in a positive outcome. And so it's a really interesting question to reflect on. What would the best leader do? Or, another one that's useful as well, similar vein, is, if a trusted colleague that I respect came to me and asked for my advice on this, what would I advise them? And often the answer to that one is, well, would you advise them to avoid the situation? Well, probably not. You'd probably advise them to have some sort of conversation to deal with the problem, right? And I'm using the example of a difficult conversation quite a lot in this episode. But I think that's really another good question. What advice would you give a trusted, respected colleague? And often the advice that you should give them is possibly the advice you should give yourself as well. So those are my 4 ways to convince yourself to do hard things. So they were considering the consequences of not doing the thing. They were also asking the identity question. Do you want to be seen as the sort of person who doesn't do these things? What sort of leader do you want to be? What sort of, do you want to be the sort of person who engages in difficult conversations because they're for the benefit of the team? Or do you want to be the leader that avoids them? Then consider it as a learning experience, which I think is really valuable as well. And finally, ask yourself, what would the best leader do in this situation? Or if you had a trusted colleague, that you respect, what would you advise them in this situation? And hopefully, by applying some of these little reflective techniques, you can motivate yourself to do something that's a bit challenging, because I guarantee sometimes you'll have to do those things when you're in a leadership role. So if you need help with these sort of things as well, hit me up on the show notes page. There is a link to my leadership coaching page, thoughtleader.com/podcast/316. And you can get in touch. We can talk about how coaching might help you, what's involved, and how it works. So get in touch if you think this could be beneficial for you. And I mentioned on a previous episode as well, a lot of the people who listen to this podcast end up coaching with me. So that could be something to think about as well. Maybe it's your time this year in 2026. So get in touch. And if you like this episode, please consider leaving a positive rating in your podcast app of choice. I really appreciate it because it helps me get the word out about the podcast and get more thoughtful leaders involved. Thank you once again for listening. I really appreciate you doing that. Keep up the thoughtful leadership. Have a great week, and I'll be back in the next one.